Welcome to this BFDG podcast. I'm Jonathan Green, chair of the BFDG, and this is another podcast in the series of interviews with winners of the BFDG Awards in 2026. The British Film Designers Guild is a growing community of around 700 amazing creatives and production designers working across film, TV, commercials, and music videos. This year, the Guild is celebrating its 80th anniversary, originally set up to raise the profile of the art department and support its members, and those values are very much at the heart of what we do today. You can find out more information at britishfilmdesigners.com. And today I'm talking to the winners of the Major Motion Picture Period category about the film Frankenstein. And I am delighted to be joined by supervising art director Brandt Gordon, decorator Shane Vieau, and production designer Tamara Deverell. So, firstly, congratulations, Tamara, on winning the BFDG award. But more importantly, huge congratulations on winning a BAFTA and an Academy Award.
Thank you.
Did you ever imagine, as a young art department member, that one day you'd be writing an Oscar acceptance speech?
No, I actually never thought of it. I didn't even really think of it that much while we were doing Frankenstein. It wasn't really, I guess it was there in the back of all our minds, but it wasn't really something that you're working towards. You're just out there trying to do the best job you can. So it's a lot of hard work, as everybody knows. And I think in the end, I feel like we did deserve it for all that work.
Amazing. I always like to start these with a little bit of background information. So, Tamara, can you just give us a brief history of your career so far?
Well, I started way back when I was in art school and I was working in the costume department. I had no idea what film was about. And I realized there was an art department and people saw that I was artistic. So I got into the art department first doing set dressing and buying. And then I sort of went just back to school a little bit at night school because I was working full time to learn how to draft and got into set design and art direction and production design. So just sort of worked my way up quickly, but I did do a period of both art direction and production design. And as Brent can attest to it, it's two very different jobs, but I really did love art directing. And I think coming at production design from art direction is it really makes you understand how an art department works, you know.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask the others as well. Brant, just give us a brief introduction to your career, how you started, and some of the things you've worked on.
Yeah, I started actually, it's sort of by chance. I was studying jazz performance music at college, and I did 1 year, and I became kind of disillusioned with it in terms of if that was going to be my future in that world. So I decided I just was going to leave that. I came back to Toronto, and then I just, it's going to take a year to kind of figure out what I might do next. I'd considered maybe studying architecture, and in the course of that year, just purely by fluke, got a job on an art department on a set, basically. And from there, I got along well with the production designer, and I just kind of kept going from there. So I was in my early 20s at that point, and just kept going and just never looked back.
Fabulous. That's great. And how about you, Shane?
I'm a late in lifer. I never really got into film until my early 30s. And, I spent the first few years on the back of a truck and just worked myself up from there. But, my career never really took off until Crimson Peak in 2015 with Guillermo. And it really just went from there. So I owe a lot to that man.
Fantastic. That's what's so fabulous about the art department, isn't it? Is people come from very different backgrounds, and I think that's what makes our team so creative. Um, Tamara, how did you come to work on Frankenstein? How did that job come to you?
Well, I had been working with Guillermo for actually many years. A lot of people don't know, but I started when I was art directing with an amazing production designer, Canadian Carol Spear, who did Mimic, and that was in 1995 or 1996. And I got to know Guillermo then. Definitely saw his vision, understood it, had a certain understanding, and then. Then I did a TV series for many years with him called The Strain, at the same time that Shane was working on Crimson Peak and Shape of Water. Both Shane and Brandt worked on Crimson Peak. And so our paths hadn't crossed. And then Guillermo sort of said to me, I want you on everything. I don't know, if something clicked in his brain. And I was like, sure, what's everything? And then it was Nightmare Alley, and then we did Cabinet of Curiosities together, and then Frankenstein. And it was actually Guillermo who suggested I look into working with Brandt and Shane after his experience with them, so that he kind of brought us together as a team, which was fantastic. Absolutely no regrets because these guys are the best.
Amazing. I mean, that's such a lovely connection there, and how wonderful to be asked by a director of his stature to come and do everything. I mean, that's really something else. So Guillermo is renowned as a very visual director, but tell us about your prep process and how you go about bringing your vision, and how much input does Guillermo have, and how do you kind of find the collaboration between the two of you in the early stages?
I mean, Guillermo knows to start a production designer early. So like on Frankenstein, for example, I started months before he was still writing the script. He had an outline. Um, and I think that's key. And he'll even hook up with Guy Davis or other illustrators before he starts a production designer to do concepts, to sell the product, to formulate it in his own head. He'll do some keyframes that, are give me the gift of what's in his head basically when I start, and the rest of the team. So a lot of research, so a lot of looking at locations, figuring out the logistics. What are we going to build? A lot of research, especially on Frankenstein, because it was a deep dive into so many different aspects of, the Arctic ship, just the Arctic itself, Scotland, the medical, science and medical field at the time, Victorian era, the costumes, just everything. So it was a lot of research and scouting. We decided early on to shoot. We looked all over the world. We decided early on to shoot in mostly in Scotland, which is where part of Mary Shelley's story takes place. So that really made sense to us.
Great. It must be a real gift to work with a director with such a strong vision. I think,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Uh,
yeah,
it's hard to imagine working with anybody else, um,
I bet.
you know, after working with him. It really is.
Mm,
And other directors have different styles, but nobody comes at it as so much a part of the art department as Guillermo does.
mm, fabulous. So obviously the Frankenstein story itself has been told before. How much did you want to retain past visual references that people will be familiar with, and how much did you want to reinvent the world?
The world we're creating is really, I have to say, it's really Guillermo's world. So, I think early on he encouraged everybody to look at other Frankenstein movies, good or bad, or look at the original 1930s versions, the 1960s versions he didn't care to see. I said, okay, I'll watch that. um you know and then forget about it basically, like, and really focus on the book, which I think he was doing very much his Guillermo del Toro version of the book, but he was still trying to remain true to the book, to Mary Shelley's story, and kind of create our own world, under his, I think all of us understand what Guillermo's vision is, and so we all contribute to that, and we know what, innately what he likes at that point. So we kind of gravitate towards that.
And that kind of leads me into, the creating a kind of style Bible, a consistency across the movie. And I guess maybe I can bring in Shane for this one. How, because I'm obviously really interested to know how you work with Tamara, how the two of you kind of find your vision, um, and keep the consistency through the movie.
Straight up, there's a really great collaboration that happens between Tamara and Guillermo. They're both extremely open to ideas. They all have their sort of thoughts, but understanding the language of them, is important. And once you have that, you can sort of add your own flavor to that. But, we've worked together 4 or 5 shows, so we really know how each other works, when to insert ourselves, when not to. And, it really is a very easy and lovable process.
That's great to hear. I mean, that's the ultimate dream, isn't it? Really, to have a lovable process. That's what we all
It,
strive for.
it is. And, I have to say that between Tamara, Brandt, and I, everyone really excels and everyone really loves what they do. And when you have that passion, I mean, for Brandt as a supervisor, for me, it's amazing because the guy is always 3 steps ahead of you. It's not, you're never chasing a thing. It's a really amazing process to have, and it just makes my job, I don't want to say easier to do, but it makes me able to heighten and actually do my job when you have to chase someone to do something. But these guys are always in front of it, and it just makes everything we do so much better.
Great. Well, look, let's start talking about specific sets because first of all, I'd love to hear about the ship set build and the frozen sea. Maybe Brandt, I guess there was some pretty big logistics to get around for that.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly one of the things in the beginning that we just had to get figured out. And the first thing we had to really nail down was where was it going to go? Because originally the plan was to try to put it inside somewhere, to have control of the lighting and the environment and to just look everywhere. And I remember going to sort of, the furthest reaches of Toronto to sort of the suburbs, looking at big warehouse spaces and old factories, trying to find space, but there was just nothing that would fit it. And there were no stages here that would accommodate it, or at least none that were available. So really trying to figure out, number one, where does it have to go? And ultimately, it just became evident to put it in the simplest place possible, which was in our studio's parking lot. And all the issues aside of just how you're going to control the sound, and it's like, there's an airport that's close by, and like all of the kind of other issues with it, it just still was the best choice. But aside from just physically where it was going to go, it was just how does the ship need to function was the big question. Aside from kind of the design things, which I'll let Tamara sort of speak on. It was just, all right, we know we have this ship. We know that it needs to function in a certain way, but what is Guillermo and what is the story going to require of that ship? So very quickly, even before we had the designs locked down, kind of trying to get from Guillermo, what is his vision of how the creature interacts with the ship when he's pushing it? What kind of a gimbal do we need to sort of think about getting special effects and an engineer on literally from day one, and also some of our key set designers started really early. Like Tamara and I started with the set designer for the ship and for the lab. I think it was like probably 45 weeks, I think, before we started ship. It was almost a year prior to shooting to
Wow.
get those sort of sets going. So that with the ship, the biggest deal was just trying to figure out what does it need to sort of, how does it need to function and what environment does it go into?
It was a pretty epic set build. And Tamara, tell us about the actual design of the ship.
It's funny because the design kind of, in a weird way, it had to function alongside these logistics of the moving ship, the how the crew is going to get it, where are we going to put it? So the design is actually, when I think back on it, those big, logistical mountains that we were climbing seemed relatively simple in comparison. It's an Arctic ship. So I did my research. I went to the Maritime Museum here in Halifax on the east coast of Canada, and we would go to as many ships as we could, just to get the look, even though they weren't quite the right era. And the Franklin expedition, which is a famous failed expedition out of Canada, I did a deep dive, met with curators, and we were lucky. We connected with a fellow, Matthew Betts, who's actually an anthropologist, an Arctic anthropologist, but he's also a ship model builder as a hobby. And so he was very helpful. Sort of, he wrote a book about the Terror, which is one of the Franklin expeditions. So we were kind of, we had help, we had inspiration, we had a look, and there were things that, there were little design things for me that were really exciting, like iron plates that we put all over, kind of Frankenstein-like on the front of the hull of the ship, which is something that this fellow Matthew Betts mentioned, that they would do this to cut through the ice. And I think for Guillermo and I, that visually was like just another added texture and an element and kind of scarring and a way to age and give rust and patina and all those things that we love. But the ship itself was pretty basic, it functioned to fit the logistics and to fit Guillermo's story and the stunt action. But there were little surprises all along the way. Like at one point, the stuntmen were testing on as the ship was gimbaling on this giant gimbal, and they were flying around. And I was like, God, there's got to be something to stop them beyond sort of this bar of wood that we put across these openings. And so I made up this net, and I ran it by our sailor, a fellow from the UK, Jim Dine, who came, and Shane can talk a bit more about him, and said, is this like this net thing? Would they have this so we can put something there? And so, there was a bit of that kind of making things up that felt or seemed historical and were along the way. So nice little surprises.
Hmm. Fabulous. And talking of inspiration, how did you create the laboratory? Obviously, that's the kind of centerpiece of the story.
Wow. Okay. So we actually, I think the lab came out. Guillermo had something in his head, and it wasn't like right there in his brain. It wasn't like, okay, this is what it's going to be. But he wanted a water tower. He wanted it to be an abandoned water tower that was like a provincial or municipal abandoned water tower. And we went to Scotland and we started seeing all these towers around, quite honestly. And I was there with Guy Davis, our hero concept artist, and we went by the Wallace Tower, and there's towers all over Edinburgh and Glasgow, usually for Walter Scott. And so we started sort of sketching, and Guy would sketch at night, little different towers, and kind of helping Guillermo kind of formulate this tower on the edge of a cliff. So that's kind of what the lab was. And then, of course, in our story, it's abandoned. It's this empty water tower, and then it becomes a lab. So there were so many scenes. We had to carefully shoot them in order and carefully orchestrate all our moves within this lab. Um, so we had abandoned, then we had sort of renovation, and then we had the full lab. And by that time, we were looking at artists like Bernie Wrightson, who's a graphic novelist who Guillermo had a collection of his drawings. That was part of our big inspiration for the lab. And the lab also came out of, Victor's quarters, Victor's apartment that he had in Edinburgh. We sort of established his equipment and stuff then, and then it just becomes grander and grander. But thankfully we have Guy Davis, who he can really be in Guillermo's brain and like pull out things like, the battery towers, the overall tower, you know, sometimes to these ridiculous scales. And I'm like, my brain wants to explode, but Guillermo wants this thing big. So
Mm.
it was literally within inches of being able to light it in one of the bigger studios at Pinewood in Toronto, the lab room itself.
Nice. I'm going to lead me on to a question about VFX, but before I do that, I'd love to hear from Shane about how you go about set decorating something like the laboratory that kind of, it doesn't exist anywhere in reality. How does that process work for you?
The big thing that Tamara touched on was Bernie Wrightson. Guillermo really, really loves Bernie Wrightson and his illustrations. But if you actually look at Bernie Wrightson, I mean, they are almost like someone that was insane doing drawings. I mean, they're extremely chaotic, they're extremely visual, and they do actually push what the concept really is to give you a feeling. So it really was the interpretation of Bernie Wrightson and how we get the essence of that man into the real world without making it overly claustrophobic and bringing it back to what the script and how it read. So for me, it really was sort of experimenting a lot with how to bring the effects of Bernie Wrightson into both the lab and into the apartment.
And that's kind of like coupled with some quite different interiors to create like Victor's apartment. How I mean, does that feel like a very different area to you, or is it all part of the same world? How do you tackle something that's like more of a realistic interior as opposed to some fantasy laboratory?
So that's a really good question because I actually don't call our film fantasy. I call it more authentic period because everything that was in there really was authentic. It came from the period. There were really no stretches of the imagination when it came to actually doing those sets. The way the body moved with the electrical jolting and stuff like that, those experiments were starting to happen around this time. So everything we kind of put in there honestly was quite realistic. But in order to bring it into Guillermo's world, Guillermo's slightly heightened. Guillermo slightly heightens everything to give you emotion, and the colors are much richer. So it's a really, that's the thing with working with Guillermo. Once you kind of understand what it is, you kind of take the interpretations and put it into his world. And that really stands out in that in those two sets.
And something like the creature's cell in the tower, Brandt, where there's obviously challenges of using water within the set. What sort of challenges did you face on that?
I think with that set, I mean that the bigger challenge, the water was not such a big deal with that, I think. I mean, we know we had our sort of trough of water. We designed it in a way where we had sort of slope for positive drainage and like all of that functioned pretty seamlessly. The bigger issues there were uh, the columns that were sort of spaced, and everything that we shoot with Guillermo and Dan Lauschten, the cinematographer, is off a techno crane, and so just that horizontal axis, like those columns were going to be a problem. So just to engineer away, and our construction team came up with a brilliant method of basically having these columns. They had like a little jack truck that they built that you could literally just go underneath it and lift it up, and within minutes you could completely have the deck clear of those columns. So we suspended the ceiling. And the other sort of tricky aspect of that set was the battery tower that had to crash through what we called the vortex, or the opening, which is sort of the opening that carries all the way through the central column of the lab. And it was not VFX really. Guillermo wanted to do it for real, and we built these huge battery towers and had to figure out a way to rig. We didn't have a whole lot of space above the set in the stage, but to rig kind of the battery to come down and crash practically. So when you see that in the film, that's one of our real battery towers going in there with just some embellishment by VFX, but for all intents and purposes, that was a practical drop of that prop for the set. But the water stuff, that was the shoot maybe was a different issue. We had a lot of, just again, with water and sort of scenic finishes, it's always a challenge to stay ahead of that. And we went through many different versions of how best to achieve it. But in the end, the water was actually the easiest part of that set, I think.
Wow, pretty impressive.
I think that there's one thing we need to add with this because Guillermo doesn't like waiting ever. So everything we do is a puzzle, and everything we do has to move extremely fast. Whenever Brandt would walk on set, either Dan Lausch or Guillermo, the first question would be asked, how long does that take to move? What's the timing on that? And the reality is you need to work out every single piece of that set so that it moves and clicks with the lab and where the water stuff is with moving columns. It is one thing that we're constantly tested on, and he never ever likes to wait. So it's what I would call a Guillermoism. You really, as an art department, need to be prepared to react to everything on that set.
That's a fascinating insight. And so we touched on VFX, but VFX is obviously a large part of such a grand scale movie. I'd love to know what elements were physical sets, and I'm feeling that most of them were physical sets versus what was VFX, and how that process of working with the VFX department works for you, Tamara.
We've worked with Dennis Berardi, our VFX supervisor, and his team for, again, many productions. We're all part of the same team, we're the legs of the table, as Guillermo calls us. And so again, there's an ease of just understanding and communication there. And it goes both ways. So I think for the art department and our team, and set deck, we have an understanding of what they're going to do, and they know what we're going to do. So we had full control of the design of the tower, even though we didn't build the whole thing. We built 8 sets out of it, including the exterior tower right up to those big scrolly legs, and up to sort of, a couple of stories high. So it was a substantial build, but then we knew they were going to take on the additional work. And Guillermo actually, for that, wanted miniatures done by Magic Camera in Shepperton. Is that where they were?
Yeah.
Shepperton. And Jose Granez did an amazing job of those. And so, even then they were, they're scenic. So they were helping with the VFX. So it was really like all of us were really working together. And, there's a trust and I know that Dennis and the VFX are only going to make it look better and bigger. And so the set extensions for the ice field, for example, around the ship, which we built, hundreds of meters of, really, of practical icebergs that moved around, and ice chunks of the ice field that had to actually wild away so the techno crane could get in. They did a seamless job of extending it and toning it in post, which I know is partly our cinematographer, but all working together. So much so that when I saw the final cut with the ship moving out to sea, I literally started to cry because I was so amazed by it. Anyways, it was such a moving moment for me to see how the rest of the story. Whereas the ship looked out into the city of Toronto, now we see the actual Arctic. So it was and it's funny because Brandt was talking about the tiled parts of all the various sets, and we had the tiled top of the chute at the top of the tower where Harlander falls to his death, and that was a horrible day for the art department because all the aging that we'd done on these tiles, and we had used real tiles because we knew there was going to be so much water, but the aging started to come off, and literally we tried everything. The crew went on lunch. We tried printing and putting aging on. There was nothing we could do. There was such a quantity of water that I just turned to Dennis, our VFX supervisor. I said, "Dennis, please, it's up to you." He's like, "No problem. No problem, team. We got your backs." So
excellent. And talking of collaborations, obviously your collaboration with the DOP is absolutely crucial. And how do the two of you find a look that's coherent? And were you always on the same page visually? Because lighting's so critical to how your sets come across.
I think Shane should talk a bit about early on work with Dan. But from my end, like I know what Dan's style is. And again, I've worked with Dan on Mimic way back when I worked with Guillermo. And I know how Guillermo and Dan will color the final thing. So I'm always keeping that in mind because there are tweaks that happen in post that if you don't know that's happening when you're working on the color palette and the aging, it could be very dangerous. It could become a very dark and scary place. So understanding how he lights and how he likes to move the camera is like the first step in working with him. And just doing a lot of testing, Shane, do you want to talk about some of the lighting tests?
The one thing about Dan and Guillermo is they're really sort of almost like one person for me. I'm not taking away from Dan at all because he is absolutely, I would say, one of the top master lighters, especially for studio work in the business. He just makes everything look so effortlessly beautiful. And once you sort of understand sort of the language of what he needs, he really is into, either the candles or the lamps and stuff. He utilizes them and he enhances them where, a lot of people cannot get a grip on that. And what I do love about him, like I have a huge problem with candles. Candles never ever look overly attractive in film. They're a hard thing to sort of get the right lighting on. And everyone knows there's single, double, and triple wicks. And the reality is Dan was really masterful at being able to label that day where we get in with certain candles and sort of how we bump the light up in a certain area in the corner and stuff. And it really is a master lighting lesson in itself. And he is very good at paying attention to that and extremely collaborative in helping us get there with it. And I thought in Frankenstein, for the candles, he did such a great job at making them look soft and making them really feel like they were part of the architecture instead of being too jarring.
And the other thing with him that is a big part of what I'm doing is, I'm thinking like a gaffer, which is what I'm using Guillermo's term to describe, the set design, the production design becomes the gaffing because of the windows. And Dan lights with single source lighting through these windows. So when I'm designing, I'm not taking, we don't go in one direction or another direction without vetting it with Dan that these windows and there's so many windows to give him the opportunities like are these enough windows? Are these the right height? How do you want to shutter them? Like in the lab, we had shutters that had to be adjustable and all those kinds of conversations and looking at models and 3D renderings and physical, practical foam core, styrofoam models. All of those are essential to the process of getting there to the end product for him.
Mm. Fabulous. It really does go to prove how important these creative relationships are in making, making a movie. Shane, just back to you very briefly. I know you were talking about fantasy versus period, but I'm interested to know just logistically, do you try and source period furniture or do you make stuff from scratch so that it has a slightly more fantastical feel to it, or do you try and keep it all historically realistic?
Honestly, I keep it mostly historically realistic. If you look at those beds, they looked, I mean, Tamara can attest to this too, because the art department really did design them. But when you actually look at them, they just look overly fantastical. But the reality is, when you travel through these castles in the UK, the tops of these beds were outstanding and they were overly thematic and they were flocked. So we added all those elements when we built those beds, and they weren't really what I would say over the top because they would sit in the rooms proportionally perfect, which is what they would do a lot. And, I always strive to do real for real. And then you can enhance it through aging and color. So that's kind of how I start. I never like to overly emphasize something or take it out of the realm of what it is. The only thing I'll really do is, furniture for me always sits too low in sets. I'm always forever raising furniture. If you really look at the film, you'll notice that things sort of sit up obnoxiously high. But really, when you look at the frame, it actually sits much better, and people look more comfortable, and they feel better and they look better when they're sort of raised and elevated. But at the end of the day, I always like real for real.
Brilliant, thank you. And Brandt, I'd love to know about well, a few things. How you go about managing such a large team on a grand scale project like this. And I know we've talked a little bit about logistics, but I'd love to know also what was the most demanding set for you and which one was the most rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the team, as ambitious as this project was, I think we did it on a pretty like relatively small sized art department. Like I think we never were there more than I was probably 18, maybe 17, 18 people total in terms of our Toronto based art department. And then we had our sort of satellite UK team for the shoot at the end. But really, it was not a huge number of people. But I think the thing that made the difference was like Tamara had said with Guillermo, understanding that the art department needs the time prior. And so we were given enough time uh, to do things kind of properly and to kind of work things out. So we never really felt, again, the schedule is always ambitious. There's always going to be sort of last minute changes, but we had the time and we were given the opportunity for those early kind of pre-prep periods where we could tackle the things that logistically you just know are going to be you have to get ahead of things like we talked at the ship. The lab is another one. I mean, the lab we had a stage that we were to get that we lost because I think it was the actors strike maybe at the time for one reason or another. A stage that we were get that was kind of earmarked to put the lab in, we lost. And so now we were forced to put that set in a much smaller stage that then, compromised the lighting and the height that we were available, like all sorts of things there had to be sort of worked out. But it's like, how do you make the best of a non-ideal kind of situation? So at the front, those logistics were the things that kind of we had to get ahead of. In terms of managing the sort of the overall team, it's just, day by day, it doesn't really seem all that overwhelming. It's, you just sort of tackle it where you have a script. And I think in the first draft of the script, the initial first set list was probably 120 plus, I think, sets. And not all of them are going to ultimately end up in the film. So you try to work towards the things that are the known quantities and the things that sort of you have to prioritize. And it's, it wasn't until afterwards, Tamara, I don't know, and Shane, how you guys felt, but you go through the whole film. It doesn't really it feels easy on some sense. Like it's hard in that you're working hard, but it's not hard in that sort of, like oppressive sense. And at the end of it, after seeing the film at the Toronto Film Festival, I was just, man, we did a lot on that film. Like I didn't really comprehend it until after the fact of like how much we had done. And you think, oh, we did that, and then we did this. And looking back on it, it just seems like, how did we ever do that? But in the moment, I found it, I mean, you guys speak to what you thought, it was pretty good, it was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. We had our challenges. I would say probably the most logistically challenging thing was the weather for us more than anything, because we were so dependent on certain types of weather where we needed snow, and it was just the worst possible winter for that, where that threw our schedule upside down. And so that was the thing every day, just trying to manage, like, we have no snow, or we're going to get rained out where we need snow, and how are we going to do this huge snow dress when it's 10 degrees outside. So those were the things that always were forcing a schedule change. And then the way I would sort of deal with that was just try to get ahead of things. So as an art department, we could offer up alternatives where if we can't go to that location because the weather's terrible, we had at least a few things in the queue that we could present to production to kind of keep things moving and keep things on track.
And with the snow, would you ever consider using fake snow or VFX snow effects or?
Well, it was a bit of everything. I mean, there was so much interactivity in certain parts of the snow where we needed kind of the crushed ice. And there was a point where then you could extend beyond it. But even with that, I mean, with an ice crusher out there, with it being so mild, I mean, and the extent of the dress that we needed to do, particularly at the ice field around the ship, or also out at our mill location, which was another one where it's just, we had machines sinking in mud, and it was just the worst combination of weather for us. But we got through it. But that was the thing that just made it very unpredictable, because we didn't know at any turn what was going to happen.
Nice. And I'm going to ask a kind of newsworthy topical question to any of you guys. What are your views on AI and how that might affect the kind of jobs that you work on, like Frankenstein, which is clearly about the craft of a lot of very creative people? How do you feel the threat of AI is going to maybe not affect these kind of movies?
Do you want me to quote Guillermo?
Yes.
He said, yeah. It's a big
I
quote.
think that's how we
You
all
can cut
feel.
that out. I actually don't feel that way. I think AI is a tool and we have to stay ahead of it. And I don't think there's any part of AI jeopardizing human storytelling. There was so much human craftsmanship in every aspect of this film, even in the VFX. I mean, those are digital artists who are doing it frame by frame, hand drawing, yes, on a computer. So we're not just punching in, oh, let's do Frankenstein's lab. What does it look like? Which people, I understand people do. It's a process, and ours starts with sketches and research and looking at paintings and how to best tell a story. And I think as storytellers, um, there's no real threat because AI, I know people say, oh, that it can write music and write stories. I just don't think it has the capacity to feel the emotions that we as cinematic storytellers can present to an audience. And there are, I mean, you would see it in our film. There's sculpted elements. There's fabric elements that are aged, that are handcrafted. There's painting, there's layers of paint, there's moss, just the moss, our moss squad that we had, that stuff, you can't just put that in. It's just carefully calculated frame by frame. And there's a whole history of humanity, of art and not just storytelling, but of visual art that we are drawing from, paintings and sculptures and the history of religion. Just it's all there. It's not you can't just push a button and make something like that.
No, well, it's nice to hear a positive view of AI. How do you feel about it, Shane?
Look, I find it utterly depressing because we're already seeing the realities of what's happening with AI right now, especially with all the massive layoffs in VFX and illustration and stuff like that. I do find it derivative. I do find it cheap looking. And I can always tell when I look at a film because there are a lot of films out there where designers have used Midjourney to get into something. And, I do find that the general public doesn't know the difference or embraces it. And that's unfortunate.
I think that's the
But
concern, isn't it? Because,
it,
will it be good enough for those kind of people that don't actually care?
it's all about training the brain. And what do we do? Do we train the brain to accept AI? And like when you look at it, like I don't want to go in and specify shows, but when you look at it, you can just tell that this is not a proper curve of architecture. This is not something that occurs naturally in life. And I find that jarring. I don't find it, something that I want to embrace. And I just do find that the film industry is going to shrink tremendously because of this. I think that, the only place it really, really helps are on these larger blockbusters that studios want to really start curtailing. I don't think it's going to affect, knock on wood. I hope it doesn't. The mid-level films, that rely on locations and all these things, even though maybe that might come up, but I don't know. I do think that AI can be used as a tool for sure, but taking away the emotion and feeling when craftsmen do something, AI is not there with it. And I don't know if they will ever get to that because it's always an amalgamation of something,
Yeah.
And so to me, it's just a sad day in life that when or if it comes, that we will be accepting this type of product. So good and bad.
Yeah.
But we tend to always go towards the bad first before the pendulum swings back. And
Yes.
so I don't know, are we going to see that? But it is definitely very distressing because it is definitely shrinking the film business extremely fast. And that's unfortunate.
And Brandt, have you noticed many changes in the industry over the last maybe 5 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I would say with AI, it's interesting because when we started Frankenstein, I think maybe ChatGPT had only been out a few months, at that point. And so really it wasn't on our radar in any significant way to the extent that it is come to be over the last few years. It's hard to know where it's going to go because on one hand, it's not going anywhere. It's only going to sort of get accelerated in terms of the tools that are being offered. And I think, like Tamara and Shane had said, it is a tool. And I think a tool in the hands of a creative individual, there's certainly it can be a tool that can be used to support that. But unfortunately, the amount of sort of slop and stuff that's out there now, it's also a tool that, it's an amplifier of the best, and unfortunately, it's an amplifier of the worst. And unfortunately, now we're seeing more of the latter.
Yeah.
I just want to add to that, cream does rise to the top, and you can always see that.
I love
I
that.
find when art department decides to use AI, that I find that they're not the most creative person. And there's someone that probably goes somewhere because they're scared to sort of stretch their brain. And we do see that, especially with illustrators and people that, sort of go that way.
That's a great comment. Obviously, Frankenstein is the kind of movie that people that aren't in the industry are going to watch and go, "Oh my God, I would love to do that as a job." What what kind of advice would you give to somebody, especially with what we've just spoken about, who wanted to get into making movies, wanted to get into the art department, what would you say, Tamara?
I think you do have to have an arts background and a visual literacy to be in the art department. And I think finding ways to expand that, which means not sitting on a computer. To me, it means travel if you can, go to museums, whether locally or internationally, look at art, look at different art forms, look at dance, look at opera, look at theater, go to museums, look at paintings, and also look at nature, because nature is, I mean, it all comes from that. I think expanding your mindset to become as visually literate as you can is a big part of working in the art department, understanding history, understanding, all aspects of the human, you know, personalities and characters, understanding storytelling, reading books, essential, watching movies, yes, but everybody does that. Um, I think you need to be also a Jack or Jane of all trades, so to speak, to be in the art department. Really, I come from a background of studying everything I could in art school, and I think all of it, for sure, I've used photography, printmaking, sculpture, painting, graphic design. I studied architectural design. I studied design for engineering at some point. All of that has been useful in my career. So I guess I'm lucky that way, but the more you can sort of fit into your world, I think the better.
Mhm. That's wonderful to hear. And Brant, just for our kind of newcomers that are already working in the industry, I'm sure many of them would love to know the best kind of route into working on a major motion picture like this. What would your advice be to people starting out in the industry?
It's a tough one because, as we've sort of pointed out, there's no kind of one route. Everyone comes to it from a different direction. But I think there are certain traits that you see with people that do kind of, get to that level, that there's an attitude of curiosity, I think. There's an attitude of openness. And I think these traits are, highly important in terms of just, when you get into the industry, to be a curious person, to sort of look at the other members, let's say in a team, and have an understanding of what they're doing, to try to learn off of everybody. I agree, like multi-talented or multi-capable people that understand the different disciplines. I think for me, hiring people is always essential. People that aren't just sort of a one-trick pony, that have experience and have worldly experience. They are well-traveled or well-read, so to sort of round out your mind. In terms of the specifics, I think it's get in there, be curious, and be as helpful as you can in the context of those early jobs in the art department. Look at the voids that need to be filled. Look at the things that aren't happening and ask yourself, how could I contribute maybe to improving this? How could I make this better, even if I'm in the most junior position in the art department? And also, a lot of times, even in the early days of my career, I learned the most probably from what not to do, so it's not all necessarily having to observe the positive and getting trained by the sort of, the top people. You can be in a project and you can learn a whole bunch of things about ways not to do things as well. So it's just keeping that your mind open, keeping curious, keeping ahead of the technology, I think, where you have an understanding of what the emerging technologies are, which is changing by the minute, and also having a bit of a grounding in the terms of the historical background of filmmaking and art and design, going back and like learning and understanding some of those older world techniques that were used in the early days of the art department. I think it is, just creates a well-rounded person.
That's great advice. Thank you. So I'm going to start wrapping this up now, but just final question. Um, Frankenstein was obviously a bit of a dream job for all of you. What would be your dream job tomorrow? What would be the next thing that you would love to do, particularly having already won an Oscar?
Yeah. I mean, I'm at that point in my career where I could choose not to work, or certainly work less. I've been sent a few scripts, and it's funny as we're talking about AI, and a couple of these scripts have been based on video games, and they smack of AI to me, and I've been completely turned off. Visually, like cool films and interesting directors, but I've just like the whole vibe of them is not, it's nowhere near the handcrafted quality and vision of Guillermo del Toro that we had in Frankenstein. So it's a tough choice. So, right now I'm kind of opting to do my own artwork, which is something I've always wanted to do and take some time
Nice.
to do that. And if the right project comes along, and it might be a project that's just a human story, like there's a couple of things I've been reading that are more just very basic, not big design shows that are just politically and emotionally something that speaks to me. Um, I think that would be more of my next show, unless Guillermo calls and says he wants to do Phantom of the Opera or something like that. Then I would definitely be there for him. But it's hard right now. It's really hard to come off of Frankenstein and all the accolades and the awards and go, okay, let's do another film, because there isn't going to be another film like Frankenstein.
Mm. Oh, that's fabulous. Well, look, thank you all so much for participating in what has been an absolutely fantastic insight into the making of Frankenstein. So, Shane, Brandt, Tamara, thank you all so much. It's been wonderful chatting to you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much for having us.
Thank you.